So we are going to continue with the global value chains chapter, and in this lecture we are going to focus mainly on the measurement of the degree of upstreamness and downstreamness of industries and countries in the global value chains. The lecture is based on the paper that is a working paper in the National Bureau of Economic Research on the measurement of upstreamness and downstreamness in global value chains. It focuses on three main contributions that were developed in the paper to the and that are considered as major contribution to the literature on global value chain. First of all, providing a succinct overview of the various measurements developed to capture the upstreamness and downstreamness of industries and countries in the global value chains. Then they used some data from the World Input-Output table to document the empirical evolution of these measurements over the period 1995 to 2011. And then they relied on several factors to explain this empirical documentation, what are the main reasons behind the results obtained regarding the evolution of the upstreamness and downstreamness of industries and countries in the global value chains. So as we argued before, world production is now mainly structured into the global value chains, and the global value chains are considered as networks of inter-industrial and inter-firm linkages. Firms will mainly source or obtain different parts or components or services or tasks from producers in other countries, and then they sell their own products to other firms and to other consumers worldwide. And since the rise of the global value chains has radically changed the way production is internationally organized, the literature has been placing a very big importance to on the specialization of countries within the global value chains. So we are mainly asking these questions: where in the global value chains are different countries specializing? Are they mainly specializing in the first stages of production or in the upstream stages of production, or are they mainly specialized in the finer stages of production or the downstream stages of production? And these questions or these definitions we have already mentioned or discussed in the previous lecture. Also, we are asking what are the main determinants of a country's positioning in the global value chains, and how countries are empirically moving up or down the global value chains. Do the positions of countries change over time, or they are the same? Are there any correlation between being in the upstream or in the downstream stages of production? Mainly to answer these questions, the intellectual foundation has been using measurements from the input-output table, and due to the great expansion of the data available from World Input-Output databases, the input-output practitioners themselves, they have showed also greater interest in assessing the global dimension of the inter-industry linkages. And by having different informations on the various entries of the global input-output table, the researcher himself can compute the upstreamness and downstreamness of specific industries and countries. However, by limiting themselves to measuring the degree at which a country is mainly specializing in the upstream or in the downstream stage of production, is lacking a theoretical foundation. So the literature has been trying to integrate or to provide a more theoretical background to these measurements by examining the different determinants that affect the specialization of countries, such as the trade costs and the composition of industries or of trade, the goods versus services, and these will be the main determinants that will be examined in this paper. So we will first examine the different measurements developed to measure or to assess the positioning of countries within the global value chains. And these measurements mainly assumes that production in the global value chains is following a kind of sequentiality, which means that the configuration of production is mainly taking the form of the snake. And last lecture we have distinguished between the snake and the spider configurations of the global value chains, where in the snake configuration, each production stage is obtaining its input from one source of upstream stage, and then it will all these inputs will be converted into the final output to reach the final consumers. While in the spider one, we assume that the downstream production stages obtain their own inputs from various sources from the upstream stages at the same time. And Baldwin and Venable in 2013 they distinguished between these snakes and spiders, and the spiders are considered as flatter GVCs, where each production stage obtain its input from several suppliers at the same time before reaching the final consumers. The unit of analysis will be the country industry, like for example the electrical and optical equipment in Australia. And the main objective is to assess the extent to which a country or industry is more upstream or downstream in the global value chain, and this will be done by relying on the global input-output table. So YSG could be interpreted as the summation of all intermediate purchases Z made by sector R in country I on intermediate inputs obtained from sector S in country G, and the global and the value added of the sector S in country G that is employed in the industry S in country G itself. So this slide mainly explains what we discussed in the previous slide, and we have the total output of industry R in country I is interpreted as the summation of all purchases made by sector R in country I on intermediate inputs from S in country G, and the final use expenditure on this output. And this is why it could be interpreted as the total use or the total or the gross output of this sector in this country. Also, this slide interprets the bottom cells in or the bottom rows in the word input-output table, and we have the output of sector S in country G is as the summation of all intermediate purchases from sector R in country I on intermediate intermediate inputs from sector S in country G, and the country G's total value added employed in the production of industry S itself. So in this complex setting, it's not easy to establish the measurements of the global value chains, but we mainly rely on two sets of measurements. The first one will capture the upstreamness by taking the point of reference the final demand, and we compute the upstreamness of the country with respect to the final demand. The second measurement will assess the downstreamness by taking the point of reference the sources of the value added to primary factors, and we will assess the extent to which a production process is downstream from the sources of value added of the sources of primary factors. Okay. So we start with the first measurement that takes the point of reference, the final use or the final consumer, and we measure the distance between the stage of production in which the country is specialized to the final demand, and this measurement of upstreamness is labeled as capital U. And by measuring this upstreamness, we can get information about the extent to which a certain industry in a given country, like industry R in country I is producing goods that are either sold directly to final consumers or that are sold to other sectors in the world economy, and these sectors themselves they will sell disproportionately the outputs to final consumers. So we consider that a country is relatively more specialized in an upstream industry if it sells lower share of its own output to final consumers, and higher share of its output is sold to other sectors in the world economy, and these sectors will then sell themselves to the final consumers. So, as I said before, this measurement this definition is mainly introduced by Fali in 2012 and by Antras et al. In 2012 also, and they defined a relatively upstream sector as the one that sells a small share of its output to final consumers, and instead it will sell more to other sectors that themselves sell relatively little to final consumers. Why? Because these sectors also are characterized to be upstream in the global value chains. So if we apply on a given sector or in a country I, this simple measurement of the upstreamness is the ratio between the expenditure on the final the share of output is the ratio between F and Y, which means it's defined as the share of output R in country I that is sold to final consumers. And this measurement will be denoted as the ratio between F, or the final use of the gross output, and the gross the final use and the gross output. So a lower share, which means that when the share of output that is sold to final consumer is lower, this indicates that there is a higher upstreamness from final use. So by simply measuring the degree of upstreamness by the ratio or the share of the output of a certain industry in a certain country in that is sold to the final consumer is not really appealing. Why? Because it does not reflect any kind of variation in the upstreamness of the industry country pair. So we should make more elaboration to the previous equations, and this by defining a certain coefficient that is called A or SIG that reflects the dollar amount of sector R in country I, of the output of sector R in country I that is needed to produce $1 worth of the industry S output in country G. So A is defined mainly as the ratio between the intermediate purchases made by sector S in country G on output of sector R in country I in the total output of sector S in country G. So the first equation in slide 12 will become as we define the total output of country of sector R in country I as the summation of the product of this coefficient by the total output of sector S in country G plus the final use of output R in country I. By iterating this industry, we can define industry R in country I, or the output of industry R in country I, as a certain sequence, and this sequence is completely infinite. So by looking at this equation, we can define as the total amount of output that is sold directly to consumers, which is F equal FRI. Okay, so this is the first step that reflects the very low level of upstreamness. Why? Because the output is sold directly to the final consumers. For the second term, we have the summation of the product of A times F, which reflects the use of output R of country I as a direct input in the production of final goods in sector S in country G. This is the second term. The third term will reflect the whole summation of the product of three terms. These terms reflect what? They reflect the extent to which the output of sector R in country I is used as a direct input in the production of a certain input that is used directly in the production of a final good and service in another country. So we have ARSIG, which reflects the fact that the output R in country I is used as a direct input in the production of an input in industry S in country G. Then the input of sector S in country G is used to produce the final good in industry T in country K. Antras and Carr in 2013, they suggested to compute a weighted average of this iteration, and this by doing what? By multiplying each term by its respective distance from the final use, and we add 1, and then we will divide by the total Y output of the sector R in country I, and this to reflect the upstreamness U. So we multiply each term by its distance from the final use, and we add 1. So F, it's the final use already, so we add 1, it will become 1 times the term F divided by Y, and we do so for the subsequent terms. And we notice that U is greater than 1, so higher level of U will reflect a higher level of upstreamness of the output originating from sector R in country I. So the previous measurement was focusing on the distance from final use by focusing on the share of output that is sold to the final consumers. Fally proposed a linear system of equations that is based on the share of output sold to another sector in industry G, and in this to another industry that is also an upstream industry. So if an industry sells a higher share of its output to another upstream industry, the industry itself is considered as upstream. And we have the capital U tilde RI, which assess the upstreamness of sector R in country I, equal 1. Why? Because we said that we will add 1 to the distance of each sector from the final use, and we have the product of B times U tilde. B, it assesses the share of a sector R's output that is sold to the industry S in country G, and B is defined as the ratio between Z that reflects the inter-industry linkages divided by the total output of sector R in country I, and that itself is what is the amount, dollar amount of sector R's output in country I that is needed to produce a dollar worth of the output of sector S in country G. And U also here is greater than or equal to 1. If it's equal to 1, this reflects that it's not a downstream, it's not an upstream industry, but it's a downstream industry. The second measurement of the downstreamness of a certain sector in a certain country mainly focuses on the distance not from the final use but from the primary factors of production or from the value added. So Fally mainly captured the downstreamness by measuring the distance of a certain sector from the economy's primary factors of production or from the sources of the value added in this sector, and the downstreamness is denoted by D, and this measurement is mainly describing the production technology of this sector. So a sector will appear to be more downstream if it uses less value added and more intermediate inputs to produce its own output. and if also it relies on other sectors that are intensive in using intermediate inputs to produce or to purchase its own intermediate inputs. So if a certain sector uses more intermediate inputs and less value added, and if it relies in purchasing its own intermediate inputs on other industries that themselves are more intensive in intermediate inputs, this sector is considered to be downstream. So other things equal, production processes that embody a large amount of intermediate inputs relative to the use of primary factors of production will be more downstream. This measurement is denoted by the share of the value added of sector S in country G in its total output. So a higher share of value added will reflect that this sector is more upstream, and if is more upstream, and it's less downstream, and simply denoted as the share of the value added in the gross output of the sector S in country G. So as in the case of the upstreamness, we need another measurement that accounts for the degree of variation in the downstreamness. So we use the coefficient B that reflects the share of output R of the output of sector R in country I that is purchased or used in industry S in country G. And the equation developed in slide 13 to reflect or to represent the bottom rows in the word input output table will become this equation, which reflects that the total output of sector S in country G is equal to the summation of the product of or it represents the purchases of the output S, the output from sector S in country G by industry R in country I, and the total use of the output S from the output from sector S in country G to produce the value added. By iterating this identity, we can assess the degree of downstreamness. So the first term, it reflects the direct use of primary factors of production in the industry S in country G. Also, the second term, it reflects the use of intermediate inputs that are produced directly by using the primary factors of production in sector R in country I. And then the third term, it reflects the use of intermediate inputs that are produced by using other intermediate inputs produced by factors of production. So it reflects what? It reflects that the output S in country G is produced by intermediate inputs from sector R in country I, and these intermediate inputs are produced by factors of production from T in country K. So the larger the term, the higher is the downstreamness and the lower level of the upstreamness. Also, we can use the weighted average measure of the downstreamness by doing the same thing as in the upstream measure, by multiplying each term by its distance from the primary factors of production, and we add 1, and we divide by the total output of the sector S in country G, and we have the downstreamness greater than or equal 1. If it's equal 1, this reflects the fact that it's an upstream sector. And the greater, if D is greater than 1, we have a higher level of downstreamness. Fally proposed also this equation that relies on that it's analogous to the other measurement that he proposed for the upstreamness measure. And A, as we defined before, is the amount of dollar amount of output R used by sector S, and therefore it reflects the fact that the higher is the amount of if sector S in country G relies more on intermediate inputs from other sectors that themselves are used intensively. The intermediate inputs did reflect that we have a higher number of production stages involved in the production of the sector's output, and therefore this sector is considered to be a downstream sector. So far we have proceeded to assessing the degree of downstreamness or upstreamness using at the country industry level. And the simplest measurements to assess the upstreamness is the share of a country's industry's output sold directly to final consumers, denoted by F over GO, gross output, or the share of a country industry's payments accounted for by payments to a primary factor of production, which mean the extent to which a country industry is relying to primary factor of production, is relying on primary factors of production to produce its own output, and it's denoted by the ratio of value added over gross output. Also, by taking the weighted average of these indices across sectors, we can assess you can obtain a summary statistics or summary measurements at the country level. However, there are different ways to do so. So if a certain researcher wants to proceed at an aggregate level and for example at the country level, he can easily either collapse the WYOT word input output table and proceed at a country by country level. For example, we can calculate the total purchases made of intermediate inputs made by country G from country I. So the total block GG, left block of the WIOT, will become will be at the country level, and we can calculate the total amount of intermediate inputs purchased by country G from country I. Also, we can do the same for the GG block of the final use sales by calculating the final use expenditures by country I, by country G from country I. So we have FIG, and this kind of aggregation is done by at the country level only, and by collapsing the industrial dimension. In the second way, we can maintain the country industry level dimension of the data to assess the average position of countries in the GVCs, and this by using the average values of industry of different industries in the total output of a certain country. So in order to assess or in order to maintain the country industry level dimension, we can obtain the aggregate for each country. However, for each country, we will use some weighted average of its downstreamness or upstreamness by using the shares of different industries in the total or in the total output or in the gross output of this country. So if we want to apply this for the upstreamness measurement, for example, for country I, we can obtain an average measure of its upstreamness by using the share of the output of the total output of this country that is sold to the final consumers. The final left hand side is the weighted average of this ratio, and this ratio is weighted by the share of a certain of sector R in country I in the total output of this country. Also, we can assess the same weighted average of the value of the share of the value added in the gross output for country G by using the weighted average of different sectors in the total output of this country. So far, we have done the measurements at the country industry pair at the country level, and finally, the researchers may be interested in computing the worldwide average measure for the GVC positioning. and this by using which means we can calculate an average for the share of final use in the gross output, or the share of value adding gross output, or the weighted average for the degree of upstreamness, or the weighted average for the degree of downstreamness at the word level. And the weights that we are going to use will be the share of each country's output in the word output. And we will find that it's logic to assume that the worldwide averages for the F over GO, or the value added over GO, will coincide with the ratio of aggregate word final consumption to the word gross output, and to the ratio of the aggregate word value added to aggregate word gross output. Also, since the whole world is considered as itself a closed economy, we can establish the macroeconomic identity between the aggregate word value added or the word aggregate payments made to primary factors of production, and the word and the aggregate word value of the final use expenditures. And the word levels will be highlighted by upper bars for the different variables. So if we calculate the word aggregate measurement, or the word averages for the degree of upstreamness or downstreamness, the main objective mainly is to capture the degree of complexity for the word production patterns. Because if at the word level we obtain since there's always an equivalence between the upstream positioning of a country is the mirror image of its downstreamness level. So if we have a high value for the degree of upstreamness or downstreamness, which means that we have low share for the value adding gross output, or the low share for the share of final using gross output, this means that the word production pattern is very complex, because we are extensively relying on inputs that are far from the final use and far from the primary factors of production, which means that the production chains will become longer, because industries are intensively relying on intermediate inputs produced by other industries. However, if we have low levels of upstreamness and downstreamness, which means that we have high value of the final use in gross output, or high value of value adding gross output, which means that we have shorter chains of production, and we are not really relying on intermediate inputs in producing outputs. So in the second part of the lecture, we will focus on the empirical evolution of the GVC positioning by using the 2013 word input-output database, and the main two facts that were revealed by using this table for the period of 1995 to 2011. It appears that countries that are more upstream are also more downstream. So we have a very strong correlation between the degree of upstreamness U and the degree of downstreamness D. And this finding is also observed when we use the simple measurements of the share of F in gross output, or the share of value added in the gross output. Also, the puzzling positive correlation is not only present in all years, but it is also intensifying, and this implies that countries that sell more output to final consumers, which means that they are also downstream, they also have a high value added over the gross output ratios. Which reflects the use of less amount of intermediate inputs in their own productions. Therefore, they are more upstream in the global value chains. So in order to do so, we will mainly proceed with the collapsed version of the word input-output table, and this is done by summing all the industry entries for each pair of countries, the country that is a source of input and the country that is the destination. and by this we can obtain a panel of country by country input-output tables. And from this collapsed version we can calculate either the simple measurements or the more complex measurements that account for the degree of variation in the upstreamness and the downstreamness for each country industry pair. Also there is a certain kind of calculation that was introduced, but we will not take this because it's a little bit complicated. Net inventory correction is introduced to account for some gaps in the calculation. And by this we can summarize the positioning of each country in the global value chain, and we can represent how this situation will evolve over time. So in order to assess the positioning of countries over time, this figure represents the evolution of the share of the final use in gross output over the time for the whole world, F over G O bar. Also we present also the evolution of the degree of upstreamness for the whole world over time, U bar. And both figures show the fact that across 41 countries from 1994 to 2012 we have a decrease in the share of final use in the gross output, or an increase in the degree of upstreamness, which implies that the production processes have been more fragmented into more stages of production, and that we are consistent with the rise of the global value chains, and that the intermediate inputs or trade and production in intermediate inputs are steadily increasing compared to trade and production of final goods. And even though the magnitude of changes is small, but the global trend is considered to be steady. So the previous figure shows that production and trade, as I said, in intermediate inputs has been rising relative to that in final goods, and this is consistent with the rise of the GVC activities around the world. And if you want to ask what would be the plot of the other two measurements of the GVC positioning, specifically the share of the value added in the gross output, or the plot of the gross output weighted average of D, the degree of the downstreamness, they will display the same trend, because at the world level we have established an equivalence between the weighted the world value of the final use expenditure and the world payments to primary factors of production, as well as the gross output weighted average of U and the gross output weighted average of D. So it will be very redundant to display the same figure another time. Also by plotting the time trend for the different GVC measures, not for the world level, but for different countries, percentiles in across country distribution for each year. We use the 25th, the 15th, the 50th, and the 75th percentiles, and by looking at the left plot, we have the same trend as before, a decreasing or a decline in the share of the final use in gross output, and an upward trend for the degree of upstreamness, which implies that countries are moving more towards upstream rather than final demand in their own production activities. For the right plot also we have a falling share for the value added, which implies that countries are distancing themselves from the using more primary factors of productions, and there is an upward trend for the downstreamness, and therefore they are more relying on intermediate inputs in their own production activities. Hence we can from these previous findings we find that for different group countries we have GVCs that are becoming more complex, and the average global production chain is becoming more lengthy. Why? Because countries are far away from primary factors of production, as well as from final demand, and therefore the distance between the primary factors of production and the final demand has greatly increased. Also, in order to examine whether there is a change in the country's position across time, the authors have run a simple rank correlation test using Spearman's coefficients, and it has been found that coefficients are greater than 0.75, and that countries they maintain relatively the same ranks in 1995 and 2011. Therefore, there is a striking persistence in their own positioning over time. This table displays the ranks of the countries in 1995 and 2011 for both measurement, the F over GO and the value added over GO, and we find that China was the first ranked country for being in upstream stages of production, and it maintained the same approximately the same position in 2011. Also, the China is also considered as being a very downstream position in the first rank for a downstream position in the global value chains, and it maintained also the same rank in 2011, while Cyprus is becoming the most the least upstream and the least downstream in the sample of countries. Also, the same trends have been displayed when using the other more complicated and more detailed measurement for upstreamness and downstreamness. China has a very high level of upstreamness, and Cyprus has lowest level in 2011 as well as in 1995. Since the above patterns does not display any changes within countries or within country industry pairs over time, a regression has been run, and this by using the 4 measurements for the GVCs at the country industry levels, and the fixed effects is displayed within country industry fixed effect level for sector S in country G. And year is the year variable is in order to display whether there is a time trend for these variation across the whole sample. So here we have the definitions of the variables that are included in the previous regression equation. And the following results that will be displayed in the following tables, they confirm the previous broad trends about the decreasing shares of the final use and the value added in gross outputs, and the parallel increase in the tendency towards upstreamness and downstreamness for all countries across the years. Therefore this implies that most industries and countries are becoming more distant from the final demand or from the primary factors of production. And also, when we inspect more closely about the coefficients, we will find that the biggest rise in the GVC measurements has happened in 2000. So it's clear here from this table that we have for the year dummies, we have a negative trend for the F and the value use and the value added shares, while we have a positive time trend for the U and the D. Also, we have for the different years, we have different coefficients for the F and the value added as share of the gross outputs, and we have also significant we have some negative ambiguous results for the upstreamness, but we have some the biggest rise has happened in 2000, because in 1998 and 1999 we have negative significant coefficients, but from 2000 we have a positive significant coefficients, as well as for the downstreamness effect measurement also. And the trend here has been is also confirmed. In In the second point, we will examine the positive correlation existing between the share of final use and the value added in gross outputs, as well as the correlation between the degree of upstreamness and downstreamness across countries over the period 1995 to 2011, and how this correlation has behaved. We know that as the GVCs have grown in their own importance as a mode of production, we would expect that countries would position themselves according to their own comparative advantages, which means that countries with more abundance in natural resources will be more specializing in early stages of production. Therefore, they will have a lower share of F over GO and an increase in value added share in the gross output, while countries will with comparative advantage in later stages of production will be towards more downstreamness, and they will be more specializing in final assembly, and therefore they will have a higher share of F over GO and lower share of value added over gross output. And if such scenario would have taken place, therefore we would never expect any kind of positive. We would expect mainly a negative correlation between F and as a share of the gross output and the value added as a share of the gross output over time. However, when we look at these plots of examining the correlation between the final use and the value added, and between the degree of upstreamness and downstreamness in 2011 and 1995, all plots confirm a positive relationship, which means that countries that are more upstream are also downstream, and these tendencies also have increased over time. And the same positive correlation existing in 1995 in 2011 confirmed the persistence and the fact that it's a very surprising fact, because this kind of correlation would never exist if in a world with no trade costs, because having a very positive correlation between F and value added as a share of gross outputs would imply that we have very high trade costs, and therefore countries will try to avoid these higher trade costs by specializing either in the upstream level of stages of production or in the downstream stages of production. Also, when we display the correlation coefficients between the variables, between these ratios across times, we find a certain kind of persistence, and that and the correlation also has increased over time, and from 0.8 to 0.9 over the whole period. And the same also correlation is existing between the degree of upstreamness and the degree of downstreamness over time. Also, in order to make a more robustness check for these positive correlations, a certain kind of regression of the value added share of gross output has been regressed on the share of final use in gross outputs, and the results are presented in the following table. The following table presents the result for the correlation between for the regression of the value added over final use, and the lower part represents the regression of the upstreamness over downstreamness, and we have all coefficients are significant and they are positive, which confirm the positive correlation between these different GVC measurements over time. So the main objective in the third part is to provide an explanation for the positive effects that were obtained from the previous data, and mainly we said that the positive correlation between the share of the final use or the share of the value added in the global in the gross output should be more relevant in a world with very high trade costs. Why? Because with high trade costs we assume that as if we are in a closed economy. Therefore, according to the national accounting identity, we will have an equivalence between the value added and the final consumption. and therefore between the degree of upstreamness and the degree of downstreamness. However, it was empirically found that the average trade barriers have fell significantly over the period 1995-2011, especially before the global financial crisis, while on the other hand, the positive correlation between the various pairs of country level GVC measures have intensified. Therefore, the authors have turned to another factor that may explain the positing facts, which is the compositional effects or the importance of services versus goods, because services are mainly characterized by the existence of short production chains, which means they have a high ratio of sales to final consumers as well as lower use of the intermediate inputs, which may explain why we have this positive correlation between the both measurements of the global value chains. So in order to account for the impact of the trade costs, they have used an index of Head and Rice that measured the cross-border trade costs at the country level, but they have applied it also at the country industry level, and they have distinguished between tariffs that are applied on intermediate inputs and on final use products. And in the following graph, we find that the iceberg transportation costs or trade costs are remaining very high, but however they are higher for the final use rather than the intermediate inputs, and this confirms the argument of the tariff escalation that developed countries in general, they prefer to impose higher barriers on trade in final goods rather than on intermediate inputs, because if these inputs are embodied in their final goods and production, they will bear the whole consequences of imposing such trade barriers. And hence, since there's a wide since there was a proof that there is a tendency towards a decrease in the cross-border trade costs, this would have helped to increase the GVC activities, and therefore the increase in GVC activity would imply also the weakening of the relationship between the share of final use and the value added as shares of gross outputs. Therefore, the authors have resorted to another explanation for the persistence of such a positive correlation between these two variables, as well as between the upstreamness and downstreamness measurements across times. So turning to the second determinant for the positive correlation between the share of the final use and the share of value added in the gross outputs, it's the composition of industries, goods versus services. Mainly the goods producing industries are mainly characterized by having longer value chains. Why? Because they have lower share of output going to the final use, as well as lower share of output going to the value added, and therefore countries that will specialize in goods industries that are more goods producing, they are positioned in longer production chains. Therefore, they are more likely to display negative correlation between the both measurements of the F and the value added, as well as between upstream and downstream. While for the services, they are characterized by having lower they have shorter global value chains, because they have higher share for the final use in the gross outputs, as well as higher value for payments to primary factors of productions as share of the gross outputs. And therefore, if across the whole country sample, across the whole period, we have an increase in the share of their services in their own, which means that if countries are more specialized in services, this would explain why we have this puzzling positive correlation between F over GO and VA over GO. And empirically, it has been found that the services share has increased from 59.5% in 1995 to 65.6% in 2011. And there has been a kind of dispersion in the services share across countries. And this graph shows that most countries, they have maintained their own tendencies across the whole period. For example, China has a negative share in the services sector, which means that they are mainly specialized in the goods producing sector, while Luxembourg and Cyprus, they are more specialized in the services sector. Hence, we would like to ask the question whether the rise in the share of services would help to account for the positive correlation at the country industry level. By plotting the relationship between the share of value added as well as the share of the final using gross outputs, and the share and the correlationship and the relationship between the upstreamness and downstreamness at industry and country level for different sectors, goods and services as well, and while pooling all industries together. These plots will show that the positive relationship is more confluent for the services sector alone, and it's weakly positive or even weakly negative for example, the correlation between the value added and the final use is weakly negative for the goods sector only, and it's weakly positive, and the relationship between the upstreamness and downstreamness is weakly positive in 2011. While, however, when we pool all industries together, we find that the relationship is quite positive, and this is mainly due to the higher share of the services sector in most countries' industries. Therefore, it's the composition effect that mainly explain why we have this positive correlation between these measurements of the upstreamness and downstreamness, and this reflects the fact that the services sector is having a shorter value chain than the industrial sector that displays a longer value chain of production. So by this we have ended our part on the global value chains, and the next time we will move to the trade policy part, and we will focus on the economics or the political economy of trade policy, and then we will focus on the trade wars, and if we have time we will talk about the trade elasticities. Thank you.